not sure. Okay. Okie dokie.
You tell how many people are online?
Mine in the last class or now?
No, like real time.
Right now it shows 0.
Oh, okay.
Now 1.
Oh, all right. Is that you?
Nope. I'm gonna be 2. Make sure that that's working. Was it on or blinking last time?
No, it was on.
See, now it shows 2. Okay,
You're optimistic.
there you go.
Coffee?
It's the way to do it.
Bobby, you want a coffee?
Social distancing.
Yep.
Coffee? I have coffee. Thank you.
All right. So the order originally, I thought we were going to do the Siyum first, and then we were going to get into the Talmud, but I think we changed our mind, and we are going to do the Talmud first, and then the Siyum we'll do at the end, so that everybody can take and leave and whatever.
Okay.
Makes sense. I think it's just an easier. Simple. But anyway. Okay. We are, if you have it hopefully in front of you, you saw the, we're starting from kind of the bottom of 5, page 5, daf 1.
What's the book that I used last time?
5-1? Five off.
That is, you want to check in that room? I think
Your
it's
numbers,
on the
your
push
numbers and
cart.
my numbers never mesh, but
All right, so it's going to be a beautiful, wonderful discussion. We are going to be learning about the commandment on Shabbos of carrying. Again, that is the carrying from one domain to another domain. Oh, because I'm on the one, that's why. Okay, this makes more sense. Here we go. Okay. All right, so before we get into this, it's important to understand a very basic concept. And this is what we learn in the verse. The Torah tells us in Exodus 36:6. So over there in the Torah it says, "Vayaviru kol b'machna." It's talking about when the Jewish people were building the tabernacle, when they were in the middle of building the tabernacle, and it says that Moses he announced throughout the camp. Vayaviru kol b'machna, and it says, "Ish v'isha," man and woman, al yasu oid, you should do no more. You shouldn't do any more milacha, meaning you shouldn't do any work. The trumas hakodesh, what work? For the donations to the Mishkan, the donations to the tabernacle. So he instructs the Jewish people to stop doing the work of the donations to the tabernacle. What does it say immediately after that? No. Sorry, we need the Shabbos one. In the cabinet, there's Masachet Shabbat. Get the Shabbos one. So he tells them, and he says that you have to get the so that they should stop doing the work of the donations of the temple. What does it say right after that? Vayikole ha'am mehavi, and the nation was restricted mehavi from carrying. So now from there we learn. And in fact, later on in the Talmud, we're going to discuss how this was an instruction that was given on Shabbat. And so, in other words, what Moses was basically telling them, that because it was Shabbat, they were not allowed to do the work of carrying, right? Of carrying from their homes to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle. Now, where was Moses? Moses was in the Levite camp, where the Mishkan was, right? That's where Moses was. The camp was a public domain. That's where everybody would come and visit and hang out because that's where Moses was, and all the questions and all the discussions, everybody came to talk to him. Everybody wanted to. And so that's where everybody was coming. That was where they congregated. It was a public domain. The way the camps were set up, there was the big public domain, and then there were the roads that went out to the private domains where people lived. So what then was the milacha? What was the work? Now, if you remember, there are 39 milachot. We're not allowed to do milacha on Shabbat. God told us not to do milacha. Here we have a verse that says that he instructed them not to do the milacha of donations to the tabernacle. What was the milacha? It says right after that they weren't allowed to bring. So in other words, carrying the donation from their homes to where Moses was, to where Moshe was, this is what was considered, we're going to start from right there. So this is what was considered this is what was not allowed. This is the milacha, and that's what we cannot do on Shabbat. Now it's important to understand, as we're going to go into all of these different things, that everything, what are we not allowed to do on Shabbat? It's not that we're not allowed to work, right? Working is not the problem. In fact, I'm allowed to schlep. I'm allowed to push something heavy. I'm allowed to sweat while I'm allowed to. I shouldn't, because that's the spirit of Shabbos, but whatever, that's a totally different story. I'm allowed to. What am I not allowed to do? What I'm not allowed to do is milacha. Milacha is what God tells us is creative work. Now, what's creative work? All right. That we look at there's one other place in the Torah where we find milacha, and that was in the creation of the tabernacle. Anything that was considered or that we find was a milacha in the tabernacle is what we're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So now we see the verse, and again, that clearly writes, Al yasu od milacha. Moses commands the Jewish people not to do more of the milacha, of the work, of what? Carrying donations from their domain, from their homes, to the Mishkan, to the big gathering spot. So from there we learn that one is not allowed to carry from a private domain to a public domain. What exactly is a public domain? What exactly is a private domain? Some of that we are going to discuss in here. But the idea is that what we learn from here is that one is not allowed to. Now, just so that we completely understand everything, and it will make it a lot smoother as we go forward, carrying from a private domain to a public domain is what was exactly instructed in the verse that you're not allowed to do, right? That is called the av milacha. That is the parent milacha. That you're not allowed to do. The rabbis learn from a simple understanding that what difference does it make if you're carrying from the private to the public or the public to the private? The point is not carrying between those domains, and therefore there is what we call a tolda, a child of this milacha. What is forbidden clearly is carrying from a private domain to a public domain. The rabbis say carrying from a private to a public or public to private, same thing. And they learn that out in the Talmud later on. However, then there is rabbinic laws which discuss, so to say, a carmelis. The rabbis then come and say that there are certain areas that are not necessarily public. What does that mean? Remember, what we're not allowed to do is the milachot, the work, or what was defined as creative work that was done in the tabernacle when the Jewish people were in the desert. So what's biblically not allowed is only things that are similar to the way it was in the desert. And because of that, there are some people that say even a public domain has to have at least 600,000 people traveling through there within a certain period of time, because that's how many Jews were in the desert in the public domain. But we'll get into some of that maybe a little later. It doesn't make a difference. The point is it needs to be similar. So in order for it to be similar, the public domain needs to be a thoroughfare. It has to be at the end of the city, or it has to connect to the end of the city through the road. It has to go through the entire city. Basically, there's a bunch of different rules that now, in order to make it similar to the way it was in the tabernacle. But then there are a lot of scenarios that are similar to a public domain, but they don't they're not categorized biblically as a public domain, such as, McCauley Road, McCauley, Brainerd Road, any of these streets, which are kind of very busy. Those are public domains, or even the street right outside that goes across, blocks. Those are public domains. The public, drive through there. It's available for anyone. It doesn't fit the criteria for biblical, but the rabbis very, for obvious reasons said, we have to be careful, because if we allow people to carry into those streets, then what? We're going to have people standing there counting how many people or how busy a street is to know whether they could go there or not. And so therefore they instructed what's called a carmelis. The word carmelis, there's 4 different places where the name comes from, but the point, the connection of all 4 different opinions is that it means someone that is not here, not there. It's not a private domain. It's not a public domain. It's not a private domain, because what makes a private domain, as we're going to see soon, private domain needs to be at least 4 by 4, and either, and with surrounded by a fence of at least 10 tefach, which is 10 fists or whatever, handbreadths. So it needs to be a fence around it. It needs to be closed in, or it needs to be elevated. We're going to see soon some criteria on that as well. So a carmelis, the street is not private. It's not closed. It's not public biblically. So it's not there. It's not here, right? Carmelis could come from the word armelis, which is a widow. A widow, which is, not married, but not a betula, as we say, not a virgin or not unmarried. She was married, somewhere in between. So, or some people say it comes from the word karamole, which means, it's the fruit before it's completely ripe, but it's edible. So it's not raw, but it's not ripe all the way, Or anyway, whatever. The point is, the word carmelis means something that's right in the middle. It's not here, not there. Nishtahin, nishtahed, as we say in Yiddish. And so a carmelis, the rabbis gave it the strictness of both. Meaning, in a Rosh Hashanah, in a public domain, you're not allowed to walk more than 4 amot with something. Even if you started in a public domain, because a public domain is just public, it's considered carrying out of the domain if you just even carry 4 amot there. Therefore, in a carmelis, you can't carry 4 amot. At the same time, because it's kind of like a public domain. But because it's not a public domain, because it's kind of like a public domain, you can't carry from the private domain into there, and you can't carry from there into the private domain. At the same time, it's not a private domain because it's not closed off. So therefore, you can't carry from the public domain into there either, and you can't carry from there into the public domain. So it has all the strict laws applied to the carmelis. But, of course, one is not liable. One is putter. One is not liable unless, from carrying from private to public and etc., because you can't give the punishment from the Torah because it's only rabbinic. Really, one is not liable. Okay, so in general, we're going to use 2 different terms here, liable and obligated. If one is obligated, if one is not allowed, it's or permitted or prohibited. Permitted and prohibited means rabbinic, biblical, whatever. It's usually we'll use it only when we're referring to rabbinic law, because the rabbis prohibit or permit. From the Torah law, we'll talk about whether one is liable. Because if the Torah says that these are 2 different domains, then a person is now liable for the punishment, which we'll discuss in a little bit. Another important thing that we have to point out before we move on, which is that a person is not liable unless there is what's called hanacha. Because what happened in the times of the temple? What was the milacha? The donation. What does it mean, donation? Moving it from this domain and putting it down in that domain. That had to happen. If the person carried it here, but then brought it back home, they didn't fulfill the milacha, because the milacha was the giving. So therefore, it needs to be put down in the other domain. So if a person, let's say, is carrying something, and this is something that you'll see in a lot of religious communities, it happened most probably every Shabbos, you see some kid somewhere walking in circles at the red light. Because what happened was he left his house without realizing, and then realized he has something in his pocket. Now, if he stops walking, then it rested. And now he took it from his house into a public domain. But if he keeps walking, until he gets into another private domain. So then already from private to private, it's not as bad. Even though one is not allowed to carry from one private to another, but that's rabbinic, definitely rabbinic, and that's much not as bad as a Carmelist. So anyway, the point is that, I mean, as a kid, I remember doing it myself. But the point, if you didn't stop, that's one thing. But if you stopped, then you brought from here to there, and that's why. If a lot of times, and I remember as a kid, I'm walking with my father, and all of a sudden I'm like, I have something. If I stopped walking with that realization, my father would instruct me, throw it on the floor. You have to drop it right there. Because now, if I continue walking, what happens? I just took it from my home, put it down here, picked it up from here, and now I'm going to bring it to a private domain. Now I did 2 times. I brought it from private to public and public to private. But the idea is that it needs to be put down. Okay? So those are some important things that we have to understand as we get into this. So now, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Hamaitzi mechanus leplatya, derech stav. If someone is bringing from the store to the platya is the big plaza where everybody, that's a public domain. But he brings it through what's called the stav. Stav is where outside of the stores, there was an area alongside basically the big public thoroughfare or the big public market. There was this little area where there were these little, like the big stones where people would sit and hawk their wares. They'd stand there and so this, because there were all these blocks over there, it wasn't really good for a public highway. You couldn't just drive through there, but it was somewhat a congregation space. So that was a Carmelis. It wasn't a public domain because you couldn't have tons of traffic, but it was a public space. And so someone was carrying from a private domain, his store, into the plaza, which is the public domain, but he went through the Carmelis. So now, the rabbis say chayev, he is obligated, even though he walked through a place that is not prohibited. Well, a place that you're not liable. So still, he is obligated, he is liable for bringing from the store into the public domain. Ben Azai Paiter, but Ben Azai says no, such a person is not liable. So now the Talmud says Bishleim Ben Azai. This makes sense according to Ben Azai. Kasavar Mahalach Ka'imitami. Why? Ben Azai holds that walking, every step you take, you're stopping. You don't continuously walk. As soon as you put down this step, you are settling in that spot. And so therefore, what happened here? I walked out of my store and settled in a Carmelis, right? A Carmelis, I'm not liable. Then I picked it up from there and went into a public domain. But bringing from private to Carmelis and Carmelis or Carmelis to public, one is not liable. So that's why Ben Azai says, even though you're not supposed to, one is prohibited from doing so, but he's not liable. So it makes sense according to Ben Azai, El Rabbanan, but according to the rabbis, even if they felt that walking is not like standing. So in other words, as long as you're walking, you haven't put it down yet. And because it hasn't settled yet, it didn't settle. But where do they find though? Where do we see? Where do we learn the idea of carrying from? From the traveling in the desert. Where do we see anywhere in the desert that they would become liable if they went through a space that is not obligated, that one is not liable for? A Makkah Patur, we're going to call it. Makkah Patur means a place where there is no liability. So where do we see that the Jewish people carried their stuff through a space? In the temple, what did they do? They went from their homes, their private, to a public space. So they went straight from private to public. So we don't see anywhere that there's any in-between space between that. So where do the rabbis get this from? Maybe if someone, even though walking is not like stopping, so yes, the person carried it from here and didn't stop, so there was no resting in a place of no liability. Where did he come to rest it? He rested it in a place where one is liable, but still he walked through a space where there is no liability. So where do the rabbis get this from that he is obligated? Where do we see it? So the Talmud tries to answer, and it says, Amar Reb Safra said, Amar Rabbi in the name of Rabbi, Amar Reb Yechon in the name of Reb Yechon. This is like someone who carries something in a public domain. Remember, we spoke that in a public domain itself, if you carry it outside of 4 amma, you're liable. So what does the Talmud say? Hassam, over there, when someone carries in the public domain itself, he carries 4 amma. So Hassam, lav avgav the kama denakit leva azal pater, ki manach lechayev, as long as the person is walking. So let's say I walk for a block in a public domain. As long as I'm walking, I'm not obligated. Why? Because I'm carrying it. It's when do I become obligated? Only once I put it down. So in other words, hacha, sorry, 1 second. Sorry. So also over here, just like in the public domain, if I walk more than 4 amot in a public domain, as long as I'm walking, I can keep walking for a mile. I'm not obligated until I put it down, right? Because it needs to be picked up and placed. Also over here, as long as I'm walking, I don't have to be obligated. I can walk through a place where there's no liability, but once I put it down, that's when it's going to make a difference. And if I put it down in a public domain, I'm liable. So the Talmud says, "Mi dummy, how could you compare these two cases? Hassam over there, kol hecha de manach le makim chiyuvu. When we're walking in a public domain, every step I'm taking, if I put it down in that step, I'm liable. I don't walk through any space where there's no liability. Hacha im manach le b'stav, but over here, I had the opportunity to put it down in a place where if I put it down there, I would not be liable." Right? If I put it down in the stuv, in the place where those stones are, where they're selling their wares, if I put it down there, I wouldn't be liable. So you can't compare the two cases. In one place, every step I'm taking, if I stop there, I'm liable. Over here, I'm walking through a space where I can put it down and I won't be liable. So we can't compare these two cases. So where did the rabbis see? Where did they get this from? That if I walk through a place of no liability, there's a private domain, place of no liability, public domain. If I walk through that space, I'm still liable. Where do they get it from? Ella, so they say no. What are we talking about? What do I mean over here in the public domain? Not that we're walking a mile in a public domain. What if I only walked 4 amot? Now, within 4 amot, the person's not liable. Person has to carry outside of 4 amot. Why? Because 4 amot is considered a person's personal space. So if I pick something up in a public domain and I walk exactly 4 amot, just under 4 amot, and I put it down, I'm not liable. I have to go outside of the 4 amot and then I become liable. So now those 4 amot are like a space where there's no liability. I picked it up. I walked 4 amot. If I put it down right there, so that might be similar to walking through the stuff, where if I put it down there, I'm not liable. But yet, once I go into the public domain, I am liable. So he says, if I would have put it down inside those 4 amot, pater, I wouldn't be liable. So now that I put it down after 4 amos, chayiv, I become liable. So the same thing should be here. We see that there is a case where I can walk through a space where there's no liability to me. But that's exactly where the Talmud says, hold on 1 second. Me, dummy, you can't compare. Over there, the space is not a space of liability. For you, it's not. But someone else, if someone else walked into that space and put it down, they're liable. It's still a public domain. It's just you, by stopping right here, you gave yourself 4 amos. But the space is still not a place of no liability. For everybody else, if they walk in there at that time, they put it down. Hacha over here, Lekuli Alma Makim P'tur. Over here, anyone can put down there and they're not liable. So you can't compare the two cases. In the public domain, yes, for 4 amot, you're not liable. But if someone else walks in there and puts it down, they are liable, which proves that the space is not a space of no liability. It's a space of no liability to you. We can't compare that to when someone walks through a space that's not liable for anyone. Anyone who walks in there now, if they put it down, they're not liable. So it's a totally different story. Ella, so the Talmud goes on to say, okay, we have to find a different one. We're going to compare it to someone who takes out from a Rishus HaYachid, from a private domain to a public domain, from the sides, of, in other words, he walks through the side of the public domain. So think about, on any highway, right, you have the edge of the highway. There's always that little space between. No one builds right up onto a real public. There's a little bit of space. So that space of the Rishus HaRabim is not really a public, because people don't congregate. You can't stand on the side there. You're not going to have people standing when everybody's walking by and everything's happening over here, standing right there on the side. It's dangerous almost. So, but it is a place where some people will stop, pull over if there's something wrong, right? So it's still a public domain, but it's a Carmelis. And in fact, this is the way, as we're going to see in a little later, but this is the way that it was in the desert as well. It was even marked, as we'll see later. But there was a space alongside the camps. We're not right on the plaza. They were a little further off. There was a space in between. People would get off from the plaza, to just tie their stuff and get back on or whatever. So there was a Carmelis. There was this space between. In order to get onto the public domain, you have to walk through these corners, these sides of the public domain, which are a Makim P'tur. That is a Carmelis. That is a place that has no liability for anyone.
What's a Carmelis?
A Carmelis, again, is that space that's not a public domain and not a private domain.
Okay.
So, a person that walks out of a private domain, if he puts it down on the side of the public domains, he's not liable. But when he moves further and puts it down in a public domain, he becomes liable. So then it should be the same by us. And this is accepted. So we do see that there is a case. We see even in the times in the desert where they did walk through a small space that was of no liability, and they became liable only when they put it there. So therefore, that's where the rabbis get their ruling from. If Papa asks a question. Now this question can simply be answered by, well, let's just, and it says this makes sense according to the opinion of the rabbis. The Amri, what did they say? The sides of the public domains are not like a public domain. So they're a Carmelis. But what about Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov? He holds that the sides of the public domains are like a public domain. Now, what's the simple answer? What do you mean? We're trying to explain the opinion of the rabbis, and guess what? The opinion of the rabbis fits with the opinion of the rabbis. Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov maybe doesn't hold. Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov holds like Ben Azai. He doesn't hold like the rabbis maybe. But of course, any time that we can take away an argument, we try to take away an argument. So the Talmud is just asking, does Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov then disagree? Does Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov hold like Ben Azai? Or does he agree with the rabbis? So, Michael, remember what will we say? And the Talmud actually answers and says no. The son of Rav Ika said, when did Rebbe Eliezer ben Yaakov say? When did he say that the sides are like a public domain? Only when there's no marks. So when people did build homes somewhat close to the public domain, there was a little bit of a danger. There are camels, things traveling with loads and whatever. All you need is the camel to take a step like this, and out goes the guy's window, right? Things are getting knocked off. And So therefore, what they would do is they'd stick stakes, and that was a common thing to do, is to stick these poles along the way. Kind of like you'll find in a lot of spaces, sidewalks where, especially in big cities, where they have these like metal sticks standing up all over. What were they there for? To keep the public domain a little bit off. So when did Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov say that the sides of the public domain is like a public domain? Only if there are no such markers. But if there are these sticks, if there are these markers marking along the way, then of course he agrees. Of course Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov agrees if there are these sticks, that the side beyond those sticks, that for sure is not part of the public domain, because people can't even travel there like they can in them. And that's the way it was in the Midbar. As we know, the camps had to be marked. And so there were markers along the way, and there was a space. That space was a Carmelis. And so we see that the people that traveled from one to the other was they traveled through a space that had no liability, and therefore we can compare, and it fits even according to Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov. So there's no disagreement; everything's good. Now, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, here's something very interesting. Rabbi Yechanan says, that Ben Azai agrees when you throw something. Now, he doesn't literally mean throwing something, but what he means here is, and in general in the Talmud, it will talk about carrying from one place to the other. It's talking about rabbinic. Throwing, he's talking about biblical. So in other words, what's it saying here? We would have thought that what's the reason for Ben Azai? Ben Azai, in other words, we just said that why did the rabbis say that you could carry through this space? Because we find it in the Mishkan. That's the way it was in the Mishkan. You might think that Ben Azai argues and says, no, there really was never such a thing in the Mishkan. In the desert, there was just a private domain that went straight into a public domain. But if that was the case, then there would be a difference between walking and throwing. Why would there be a difference between walking and throwing? Because if you threw, then it never rested at all. If you threw it, right, then it didn't rest. Now, if there was such a place in the tabernacle, if there wasn't such a place in the tabernacle, there should be no difference between throwing and walking. Why? Because if there didn't exist such a thing, if there was no such thing in the desert of a space that had no liability, right? So if the private domain was right up against the public domain, then we never see a case of liability when you carry through a space of no liability. That would make no difference if you throw. That would make no difference if you walk. But if there was such a space, like we just said, that there was such a space, that really the tents of the Jews were here, there was a space on the right that was marked off, and then there was the public domain. So now, according to Ben Azai, there would be a difference. Why would there be a difference? Because what did we say the reason of Ben Azai was? Every step you take is like you stop. So when you're walking, as you walk out from a private domain into this space, you're not liable. Now you walked from that into there, you're not liable, because every step you took was a stop. But what if you threw it? What if you threw it from a private domain to a public domain? So it crossed through and it landed. We do see liability because there was such a thing in the temple, right? And so therefore, the throwing, and now, so now the Talmud is basically saying that we have proof to our reasoning that the reason that Ben Azai disagrees with the rabbis is not because there was no such thing in the times of the temple. We have proof that there was such a thing in the temple. Because Ben Azai says if you threw it, you are liable. Where did he see that? We see it in the temple. So then why did he say that walking, you're not liable? Only because he holds. We must say that it's because he holds that every step you take is like stopping. And so now we have proof. And in fact, Amar Rav Yechanan, Umayda ben Azai, so we see the Ben Azai admits besaidik when you throw it, you're liable. Tanya Nami Hachi, we actually learned this in a brisa, and we have it clearly in the brisa where it says, if a person goes out from the store to the plaza to the big derech stuff through this, the no liability domain. Chayev, he is obligated. That's if he goes out or if he goes in. And if he throws. Or if he brings in, catches. Ben Azai says, if you walk, if you carry it out and in, you're not obligated. You're not liable.
You're not liable anymore.
But someone who throws or draws in, that chayev, then he is obligated. So we see clearly that this is the debate between Ben Azai and the rabbis, whether when you're walking, is it like you stopped each step of the way, or as long as you're walking, it didn't rest. And as long as it doesn't rest, if you recall, we said one cannot be liable. All right, very good. We all good here so far?
Mhm.
All right.
So what was the first sentence again?
The first sentence was Toner Rabbanan. The first sentence was the rabbis taught. Toner Rabbanan, the rabbis taught.
honey.
Daled Rishuyas l'Shabbos. There are four Rishuyas. There are four domains on Shabbat. So in other words, there are four different domains. And this is gonna tie back to what we said at the beginning. There's a Rishus HaYachid, there's a private domain. There's the Rishus HaRabim, there's the public domain. There's the Carmelis, there's the not here, not there domain. And then there is a Makim Ptur, there is a space of no liability. Although a Carmelis is a space of no liability, there's a place that's even less liable than a Carmelis. All right, the Ezahi, now it's going to explain the different places. The Ezahi Rishus HaYachid. What is a private domain? Charetz, Shahu Amak Yud, V'Rachav Dalet. A pit, if you dig a pit 10 tefach down, and it is 4 tefach wide, so it's 4 by 4, 10 tall. Then it's a private domain, and you can carry around in there, and you can do whatever you need in there. The same thing is a fence. Now here there is a couple different ways of understanding this. According to most, we're discussing over here an actual, because the Talmud is not giving us the simple things. The simple things we know, as we're going to see later, it's coming to teach us something. The simple private domain is a space that is at least 4 by 4 that's surrounded by a fence, and the fence is at least 10 tefach tall. Is it 10 tefach or 10 amma? Are we talking amas or tefachim here? Hold on. Yeah, we are talking tefachim. Okay, so that it has to have a fence of 10 tefach tall. Here we're talking about, though, according to many opinions, most opinions, we're talking about a very interesting thing. Think of a wall that is 4 tefach wide. So we're talking about a wide wall, right? 4 by 4, and that is at least 10 tefach tall. So it's a fence this tall off the ground, 4 by 4. So now on that space, we consider as if those walls continue up. Once it's 10 tefach, it's a separate space. It's as if it goes all the way up. And so on there is a private domain as well. So he says, this is a complete private domain. Why does it say this is a complete? We'll discuss later. Now, what's a public domain? Siratio. It's like a highway. Uplatio or gedela or a big plaza where the marketplace. These are the big wide roads that go through the city, that go all the way through from beginning to end. This is the typical Rishus HaRabim. Zuhi Rishus HaRabim Gemura. This is a complete Rishus HaRabim. We'll discuss later why it says this as well. Now, ein meitzin Rishus HaYachid zu l'Rishus HaRabim zu, ve'ein machnisim Rishus HaRabim zu l'Rishus HaYachid zu. One is not allowed to bring from the private domain to the public domain. One is not allowed to bring from such a public domain to a private domain. Ve'em haitzi ve'hichnis, if someone does. V'shoigig, if it was by mistake. Chayev chatas, he brings a sacrifice, a sin offering. B'mezid, If someone does it on purpose, Anosh Karis, then he receives Karis, which is death by heaven. The Niskal, or if there are witnesses and he was warned and everything like that, then and he's warned and said that you are going to be put to death if you do this, and he says, I don't care, I understand I'm going to be put to death, but I want to do it anyway, then he actually gets killed by the Beit Din, he gets stoned. So that's all if one carries from the private domain to the public domain to the
There's countries that's still doing it today.
Avol Yam, but no, there's no countries there.
Yeah, Iran,
They do not do it like this.
Skila.
Totally different laws. They do skila maybe, but not like this. This is a totally different law. And they don't have the warnings that are obligated like this.
No, they don't do warning. They just kill it.
So I'm saying all the laws don't apply.
Saudi
You
Arabia,
shouldn't-
same thing.
God forbid to compare the skila that the Torah talks about to what is done in some of these
They have
countries.
enough rocks.
Anyway, but a yam, a ocean, or any big body of water, or bika. Bika is not necessarily a valley. Over here, it means like just farmland, the open land outside of the city, all that. The country. The istavanis.
What is
Istavanis is the same term we said earlier of stuv, right? That's
okay.
these places where they have those stones and people sit on and sell their wares. The carmelis, or a carmelis. Talking about specifics, it gets later on. So these are not like a public domain and they're not like a private domain. The ein noisin v'noisin b'seicha, and one may not carry within it 4 amos, like we said earlier. The im nasim v'nasim b'seicha, and if they do carry within it, putter, they are not liable. The ein maitzim b'seicha, and one cannot carry from a private domain into it, or from it to a private domain. One cannot carry from a public domain into it, or from it to a public domain. But if someone does do it, putter, he's not liable. Now, Chatzeda Shorabim, here's another addition. Chatzeda Shorabim, a space, so this is not really a carmelis, but it's like a carmelis. It's not even the Mukim Torah. This is kind of like an addition to the carmelis. Chatzeda Shorabim, umuvais she'enan mefulashim, the courtyards of many. So the way that they used to have homes, still today there are such things, but the way that they would have the homes is that they were like a group of homes that opened up to a courtyard, and that courtyard was shared by these few people. Then usually there were a bunch of courtyards that opened up into a road that went to the public domain. So that road was closed on this side. So there was a courtyard here, a courtyard here, a courtyard here, houses around this courtyard, houses around this courtyard, houses around this courtyard, and the road that went opened up into a public, the thoroughfare. So now these little courtyards, they're a little more private than an ocean, right? They're a little more private than where people are selling their stuff. Because if someone comes to sell their stuff in my courtyard, even though it's my neighbor's courtyard too, I have the right to tell him to fly a kite. It's a private space, but it's also not completely private because it's shared with others. So it's kind of similar. So such a space, there's something unique. Ervu, there was something called an Eruv. The rabbis allowed for the people sharing a courtyard to make an Eruv. What's an Eruv? An Eruv was that all the different people together would come together and bake basically something together. And then by baking something together, they sharing their homes, it becomes one space. So if they did an Eruv, and this can also be done in that little street, right? That little street that goes to the public domain. If all of the courtyards, all the people of all the 3 different courtyards, let's say, come together and make an Eruv, then you're allowed to carry in and out because it all becomes like one house. So if you did the Eruv, then you're allowed to carry Lai Ervu, but if you didn't do the Eruv, Asurim, you're not allowed to. Now in that street, there's an extra step you need to do, which we're going to talk about soon. So I'll just mention it now. But on the street, you have to do what's called either a lechi or a koreh, meaning you have to put a stick either along the wall or across. That's a recognizing, that this is our private space.
And what about the wire?
Sorry?
The wire.
That's an Eruv. That's for personal, private property sometimes. You have to have a sign sometimes. It's all part of an Eruv, yeah. The wire is what does it for the city, kind of. Yeah. Whole nother. That's making doorways. Anyway, whatever. We won't get into that.
It's all.
So, but if they didn't make the Eruv, if they didn't join together, then it is forbidden to carry there. Now, the Talmud goes on to explain a Makim P'tur. What is the Makim P'tur that we said? A place of no liability. Adam Emid al Iskufa. Now, when people would walk out of their homes, there was like this threshold. There was this space that was its own space. It wasn't really part of the home, and it led into, whatever the public street or whatever it was, the Carmelists. But that had its own laws. It had to be smaller than 4x4, because if it was more than 4x4 and taller than 10 tefach, then it becomes its own private place. But anyway, here we're talking about a little stone. So a person can stand on that. You can take from the house the noisamai and put it on that stone. Or you can take from outside, from the Carmelists or wherever the poor person is, public domain even, and put it onto that space. But as long as he's not allowed to take from the home and pass it to the guy over there, because he's standing here and say, yeah, I didn't do anything because I'm standing on this place of no except. Now, really, one is not liable if he does that. The reason he can't do it is because the rabbis instituted not to do that, because then we're all going to start figuring out how to carry things in from one domain to the other domain. And if he did do that, though, nobody's liable, because that's a space of no liability. Others say, according to some, others might be Reb Meir. There's a story where he was referred to as others for a little while because of something that disrespect that he showed to the head of the yeshiva, whatever. But anyway, we're not sure if this is or not. The point is that it could be that it is. He says, Iskufa mishameshes beis reshuyos, that actually this makim p'tur, this space, it actually serves either as one or the other. What does that mean? When the door to the house is open, it's considered just like a private domain. Pasa, no, but when it's locked, Pesach, no, but when the door is locked, then it's like the outside, because now there's no access to the inside. And if it was 10 tefach tall and 4 on its own, then it's its own space. This is all the wonderful brisa. Now we're going to take it piece by piece, and we're going to explain every detail of it, why it was all needed. All right. So, okay. All right. All right, very good. Okay. Let's get going. I don't think I'm missing anything yet. Amar Mar. We learned in the Brisa, Zuhir Shusay Yachid. This is the private domain. So in other words, it started writing and it said, what is a Shusay Yachid? What's a private domain? Right? And it goes on to explain a private domain is, and it gives a couple of examples, and it says about the right, if it's 4x4 and 10 tefach tall, or if you dig down, and it says, and these are a private domain. We were just explaining private domains. Why does it have to tell us, and these are, unless it's excluding something? What's it excluding? Lemiyute, so it's coming to exclude Hadid Rav Yehuda. It's coming to exclude the case of Rav Yehuda. There is Rav Yehuda comes and says that there is a private domain, and the Mishnah is coming to say, no, that's not a private domain. What did Rav Yehuda say? The Tanya, because we learned in the Brisa, yes, it all came. Even more than this. Amr Rabbi Yehuda says, so Rabbi Yehuda is adding. And the Yeser al Kain, hold on. Oh, yeah. Okay. So there's a brisa where it's talking about, where Rabbi Yehuda is talking about if there is a roof over a public domain. And so basically, there's these homes and there's this roof. And so over there, you're allowed to make a sign. You're allowed to put this post up there. And basically underneath that roof, which is walled from two sides. So let's say you have and the public domain goes underneath it. So let's say a bridge or something like that, right? Where you have the two walls. So then you're allowed to put a korah. You're allowed to put the sign, the stick on one side and on the two sides. And then it becomes like a private domain. But now he says even more. Or that's any space, actually. Sorry. If there's just if there's a space, it's not talking about a public domain. Mm-hmm. It's talking about if you just have, let's say you have a house over here and a house over here, and there's a roof that connects the two. So then you can put a post on both sides. And so typically, as we just discussed, the rabbi said that even if you have three walls, then you need to put that post and then you can carry in that space, right? Rabbi Yehuda was saying that if you just have a house over here, and it's covered, you can put the posts on the two sides and you can carry in there. But then he says, "V'yeser al kain," and even more. He says, and what was the even more? If you have two houses on two different sides of a public domain, so now even the public domain is going right through it, and there's no roof on top. So if someone has beis bottom mishnei tzidei reshus rabim ois lechi mikan v'lechi mikan, he's allowed to make that post on one side and a post on the other side, oy koda mikan v'koda mikan, or that stick going across on both sides. V'noisam emson, you can carry in between. Amru lai, and they told him, Eima arvin reshus rabim bekach. You can't close up a public domain like that. If the public domain is going through here, then it's a public domain. You can't close it off. So the Mishnah, when it came and said these are the private domains, was coming to exclude Rabbi Yehuda. So then why does it say these are the complete private domains? So here's something very interesting. Because you would have thought, in other words, you would have thought, someone may have thought that they disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, not that two walls that on two sides make a private domain. So in other words, Rabbi Yehuda is saying two walls. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say that putting just those sticks over there are good enough? Because he says that two walls on the two sides really, biblically, is already enough to make it a private domain. Biblically, that's enough. It's closed in. It's a private domain. However, the rabbi said, what do you mean? There's a public, the public is walking through. It's a public space. So to take care of the rabbinic problem, we put those posts there and it's okay. So you might think that the rabbis disagree and say, no. You're right that the two walls make it a private domain, but the rabbis insist on having at least a third wall in order to be allowed to carry there. As if there's only two walls, the rabbis do not allow, even if you put that up. You might think that's the argument. So the Mishnah came and added the words gemura. And the Mishnah came to add that no, only these are a complete, meaning all the way through. And again, over here you see the word lizraik, throwing, and carrying. it doesn't literally mean throwing or carrying. What it means here is carrying is what's permitted or prohibited by the rabbis. Throwing is the term that we use where you're liable. And so, in other words, what he's saying here is that you might have thought that the rabbis would say that one is not liable in carrying in there because biblically it is a private domain. Maybe the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda in that case. Comes the Mishnah and says, no, Gemurah. These are complete. In other words, there is a case somewhere where someone says that this is a private domain and it absolutely is not, completely not a private domain. And who is that case? That's Rabbi Yehuda, meaning that the rabbis argue with Rabbi Yehuda that biblically 2 walls do not make it a private domain. And in order for it to be biblically a private domain, there would have to be a 3rd wall. Now, biblically, it's private. But the rabbis instituted that because it's similar to, and like we have in the other cases. Is it good?
There's not going to
Continue.
be a test on this.
All right. So here's the next case. Now the Mishnah continues. All right. Amar Mar. We also learned. Zuhi Rishus Harabim. This is a public domain. We spoke about the highway, we spoke about the big plaza where everybody, the marketplace, and we spoke about those roads that go all the way through. Why did it have to say that? Same question. Started off saying, this is a public domain. It gives those lists, and then it says, and these are a public domain. What's it excluding? Idach de Rabbi Yehuda. It's coming to exclude another law of Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanan, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? This is talking about very interesting law. People, when they would travel up to the temple, it took weeks, right? They're traveling, they're on their way and on the roads, and along the way there were a lot of wells. And oftentimes they would have to camp for Shabbos, right? They're traveling, they would stop for Shabbos, they have to camp. So they set up their camp, but now they can't take from the well. Why can't they take from the well? Because the wells were big pits that were 4x4 and at least 10 tefach down. So those are private domains. Taking it out and bringing it into the wilderness, which is either a Carmelis, whatever it is, it's a Carmelis. It's not a public domain necessarily, but or whatever it was. The point is, it was a public domain if they were stopping on the roads, which is where they usually maybe had these wells. So now I can't draw water. How are we going to feed the animals? How are we going to have? So the rabbis instituted that they were able to build these like corner brackets. They were like L brackets, an amma each way. And they went on all 4 sides. Okay. So now there were like these little L-shaped things, one here, one here, one here, one here. And the rabbis instituted that within that space, it becomes a private domain and you're allowed to carry. So therefore people were able to lead their animals to that space, draw the water out, they'd be able to drink there, and that's it. So this was all instituted in order to allow for the people that were going up to the temple and everything like that. So
The Jewish brain finding solution for everything.
So Rabbi Yehuda says, if the public domain was going through these brackets, you have to put them aside, because if they go through, it ruins it and it's no longer it's a public domain. It's not a private domain anymore. But the sages say, nah, ain't it tzarich, you don't need to. So now they just switched their opinions. Before, with the 2 walls, Yehuda was like, don't worry. The sages were like, no, you got to worry. But it's real simple, the reason why. Rabbi Yehuda believed 2 solid walls makes a private domain. When you have 2 solid walls, you're good. But if you don't have 2 solid walls and all you have are these little brackets, then if a public domain is going through there, these brackets are worth nothing. The rabbis, on the other hand, said 2 is worth nothing. You need 3 or sum of 4. When you have these brackets, you have a little bit of all 4. And therefore, it's a private domain no matter what. You don't have to worry. So that you're beginning to see the difference between the two opinions here and what's a public, what's a private domain.
So that's why they all agreed that if you put a post at each end, you had 4 walls.
If you put the
Right.
post,
Right,
yes.
if you put a post at each end of that alley. The 2 walls plus the 2
They
posts.
don't agree. They don't agree.
They
on
don't
that.
have walls, they have posts.
No,
But
court-
that would give you 4 partial walls.
No.
2 full
So
and 2 partial.
the third wall, you need to have, so over here, because there's an amma literally of each one, so therefore we consider as if, and again, this is not a lawful enough sign that this space is, but just putting a little stick on the, what's it called? The rabbis don't agree.
That's not enough, okay.
On the thoroughfare through, the rabbis don't agree with that. You can't put on the 2 sides and it would be enough. Right?
Right.
Where did you see that the rabbis agree with that? In fact, that's why they said Gemara.
Okay.
So, all right. So, so this is where it's coming to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and it's coming to Rabbi Yehuda that where Rabbi Yehuda felt that if they go through these 4 posts, these 4 bracket posts, that becomes a public domain. The Mishnah says no. Zu Hidush Hashanah. This is a public domain to exclude Rabbi Yehuda. Now the Talmud asks, like we asked earlier, why does it say this is a complete public domain? So now the Talmud just answers, I did the Tanaresha because it said it at the beginning. Tananami Seifa. Really don't put any weight on those words, just to make the symmetry flow. It said that this is a complete private domain, therefore it also said the word complete by the public domain. So now the Talmud asks, why didn't it include a desert in a public domain? When it says the examples of complete public domains, the desert's the best example because the desert is where we get it from. The Jews in the desert. The Hatanya, we actually learned in a brisa, we actually see in a brisa where it says, what's a public domain? And it says a sratya, which is the highway, platya, the big marketplace, and the big roads that are open through and through, the hamidbar, and the desert. So why didn't it include the desert here? So he says, Abaye says, one is talking about when the Jewish people were in the desert. One is talking about today. When the Jewish people were in the desert, yes, the desert became a public domain. And basically what it's teaching us, then why does the Brisa have to teach us about what was then? What it's teaching us is that if there are an equivalent number of people that were like the Jewish people traveling in the desert, then the entire desert becomes a public domain. Even today, if 600,000 people go out to a party, to a big fest, a music festival in the desert, or some people say it doesn't need to be 600,000, but if there's a very large number of people that are living or camping in the deserts or whatever, then at that time, the desert becomes like a public domain, and the entire desert does, and that's what the law comes to teach us. But today that there aren't so many people living in the deserts and everything, the desert is not a good example, so our Mishnah leaves it out, our Brisa. That's what he says. All right. We've got one more piece to learn here. Amar Mar. Our Mishnah continued and said that if you carry from the private domain to the public domain or the public domain to the private domain, by mistake, you have to bring a sin offering. Pshita. Obvious. We know that. How do we know that? Because the Torah writes clearly, we have in the Torah in Exodus 31:10 or 14, where it says over there that if a person sins on the Shabbat, he kares tikares, they will then get this death from heaven, the karet it's called. Any law, when does a person bring a sin offering? A person brings a sin offering when he by mistake committed a sin that he gets kares for. So we see clearly in the Torah that it says someone who desecrates the Shabbos gets kares. So we know that if he did it by mistake, that's the law. Any case of kares a person does by mistake, he has to bring a sin offering. So he said the mezidonish kares v'nisko.
What it's
Oh,
after.
sorry. I skipped. I needed it. Why did we write all the punishments? Only to teach me the laws that if someone does it on purpose, then he could get stoned, or if he was warned and all that, or he gets kares. But this comes to teach us Rav. This teaches us the law of Rav. What did Rav say? The Amr Rav. Rav said, "Matzasi Megillah Stadim." He found in the hidden writings, Beit Rav Chia, in the house of Rav Chia. You see, Rav Chia was a student of Rebbe. He was the teacher of Rav. Rebbe was the one who actually compiled the Mishnah, right? How did he compile the Mishnah? He had a bunch of hidden writings. What's a hidden writing? The oral tradition was not meant to be written down, right? And so the oral tradition was passed down orally, and there were all these people that had, and it was not meant to be written, but there were a few exclusions. For example, if someone found something, a teaching that they never heard, and they wanted to remember it, they're allowed to write it down. Some people say even that just for notes. Any student was allowed to write for himself. They weren't allowed to write it down for others. So basically, every single sage, every carrier of the tradition had a bunch of hidden writings. Hidden meant no one else was allowed to see them. They were for him. However, when Rebbe came to compile the Mishnah, right, he collected all of these and he had many of them. Rav Chia was a student of Rebbe, snuck in and had access. He was actually his secretary, and so he was able to get in there and look at some of these. So Rav says that he heard from Rav Chia, who saw in these hidden writings, and it's written there that Isi ben Yehuda said, "Avos malachis mem chaser achas." How many parent? Remember, we spoke about parent and student. Parent is where it's clearly written in the Torah. Student is what is obvious from there, and then you have rabbin. So there are 39 milachot, prohibited actions. There are 40 minus 1. There's a reason it says 40 minus 1, but we'll get to that later. And a person is not obligated. Now, at first, the Talmud understands this to mean that a person, if he does all 39, he only gets one. He's only liable for one. Meaning, let's say by mistake, I did every one of those 39 things. I only need to bring one sacrifice because I desecrated the Shabbos. It's one general thing. So now the Talmud stops right away. It says, what? Amy, what do you mean? This can't be. Vatanan, we have a clear Mishnah that says, Avis malachis mem chaser achas, that the father, meaning the parent, melachot, prohibitions on Shabbos, are 40 minus 1. And we asked, Minyana Lamali, why do we have the number? Why does it tell us that there's 39 things you can't do on Shabbat? And what did Rabbi Yochanan teach? To teach us that if you did all of them in one shot by mistake, you are liable for each and every one. That's why it gives us the number. The reason it gives us the number is because to tell us that each one is on its own. If you do all 39 by mistake, you have to bring 39 sacrifices. Ella ema, only you should say al achas mehen. So he says, no. What did the hidden book say? That when it says einay chayav al achas, that you're not liable only one, it meant you're not liable on only one of them. Meaning that there's one of the 39 that if you transgress, you're not liable. One of the 39 things are not liable like all the others. Meaning all the other ones, if you do it on purpose, you get karis, or skila, or you get stoned. If you do it by mistake, you have to bring a sacrifice. There's one of the 39 that you're not liable for, but we don't know which 39 that is. And that's why our Mishnah, our Brisa came and wrote here that if you carry, you get it. What's it trying to tell us? This we know. This is one of the ones that we don't even question. We know that you're liable for. And so that's why the Brisa comes and writes the punishment to tell us this one is not one of those that we're not sure. It's not that one that we learned about from Isi ben Yehuda that read from his writings that there's one that's not liable. We don't know which one that is, but we can be sure that this one you are liable
Do you
for.
know which one
That's
it
why
is?
the Brisa says it.
Oh, come on, you should.
And so with that, that's the page. Of course, it's a beautiful concept when we're talking about carrying. This is the logistics, where the Torah writes clearly, like we began. Moses instructs them not to carry the stuff for the temple, but of course,
Mandy,
The
that's a question
prohibition-
for you for next week.
the prohibition of carrying on Shabbos goes much deeper. And the whole idea of Shabbos is that the world goes back to its source, where there's a unity, where we recognize the godliness that exists in everything. It becomes all a private domain. And this is really one of the explanations. And the meditation we can have when we don't carry on Shabbos is the idea of not taking from God's private domain to a public domain, meaning the public domain is how we see the world all week, fragmented. There's evil, there's good, there's this. On Shabbos, we get to pull back and realize that everything is really all God's domain. It's one domain. And on Shabbat, we train ourselves that when we go into the week, we shouldn't carry from the private domain to the public domain, meaning we shouldn't break up the world, but we should bring that recognition with us and unify everything to the one private domain, which is God's domain. We will make a siyum. Robert, you want to make the siyum on brachas?
I didn't bring it.
I can bring it for you.
Well, do you think you'll go out of it so easy?
Or we can I'll make a siyum right here, and then we'll be able to enjoy and make l'chaim.
Okay.
So we'll make a siyum since we
There's more
finished,
people over there?
since we started a new thing here today.
There's more people in the other room?
Oh, the person
The
that was
library?
there just went off. Oh no, there's still someone on. Okay, hold on. Talmud brachot.
What does seal mean?
Siyum means completing or
Oh.
finishing it up. So the Talmud concludes, and it says, it's talking about the the greatness of the sages and the honor that needs to be accorded to the great Talmidei Chachamim, to the great sages, and the Talmud says like this. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Lazar said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim Shalom Ba'elam, the sages bring peace to the world. Shenamar, like it says in the verse, V'chol b'nayich l'modei Hashem, all of your children shall be taught, of God. V'rav shalom b'nayich, and great shall be the peace of your children. So he says, Al terkei b'nayich, don't read it as your children. Ela b'nayich, you should read it as the builders. Who are the builders? The builders are the ones that build the God, which is the ones who study Torah and teach it, and etc. Shalom Rav la'oyves ha'esach v'ein lam michshal. And the Torah continues. So in other words, it's referring to the scholars. And so it says, those who love your Torah have great peace. There's no stumbling block to them. Yehi shalom b'chelech shava b'arnasayich, and may there be peace in your gates and tranquility in your palaces, buildings. Laman achai v're'ei, and for the sake of my brothers and my friends, Adav and Hashem Bach, I speak only for peace. Laman beis Hashem Elokeinu avaksha tevlach, for the sake of God's home, we search only good for you. Hashem ozlam and may God give strength to His nation. Hashem yavarech Hashem Hashalom, and may He bless His nation with peace. And with that, we conclude the tractate of brachas, and now we're going to party.
Oh, hardy, huh?
Grab something to eat.
Party hardy. Put this one there.
That was
Right.
You, Menachem Mendy,
Yeah.
you sound like a drunk.